image. Let's start by, as I mentioned earlier, for your assignment number 6, you're going to have to create a series of 3 HDR images. Okay, if you go to Canvas, let me go backwards a little bit. If you go to Canvas and you go to our course and you go over to Files and then Support Files, you're going to notice a folder called Hdr Imagery. Okay, I am actually giving you 4 sets of HDR images. So when we were outside when we were doing our photography on the second or third lecture, one of the requirements was to create a bracketed set of images. Okay, so this is what that is. Okay, so if I click on, for example, one of these folders, these 3 images is going to be a bracketed set of images. Okay, so one is going to be an overexposed image, one's going to be a underexposed image, and one's going to be a normally exposed image. Okay, so that's going to be a bracketed set of images. Okay, so the reason why I didn't do that on the first day is because typically to do these successfully, it kind of requires certain tools and kind of the ability to operate the camera actually really well. So I wanted to give you guys a little time to kind of get to know your cameras a little bit. So if you actually create one of your HDR images, so one of your 3, if one of those 3 is actually a set of bracketed images that you take, I'll add on an extra 5 points, okay, for the project. Okay, so we'll take extra time in actually creating a successful HDR image. Don't just go outside, on your front porch and just take a picture outside, underexposed, overexposed, regular. Try to create something that's actually interesting and something that you ultimately want to see. Okay, so maybe it's going on a hike or something like that and taking a picture of a scene, or maybe you're in the city. So actually try to create an interesting scene. Okay, so you have 2 options. You can either create 3 HDR images using the images that I've provided you. So you have 4 sets of bracketed images here, or you can go out and take some of them yourself. Okay, does anyone have any questions on how you would do that? Okay, does anybody? Yes.
My camera and my phone, it's new to me. It does have an HDR thing you can tap, but I tried it. It doesn't get 3 images. It just gets 1 image.
So what if you actually let's talk about your phone and how it works for your phone. So yes, if you have an iPhone, there is a button called HDR Image. What that actually does is it does take 3 images for you right away, but it creates the image itself right away. It's not going to give you the set of images. And I think your iPhone actually takes 2 images. It takes an overexposed and an underexposed, and then it creates the one. It's still technically an HDR photograph, but it's not ultimately what we're after. It's not going to be as good as what you can ultimately get. I will be honest, and taking an HDR image with your phone is quite difficult. Is it possible? Yes, you could get a mount, and you could probably do it pretty well, I guess, if you have the right tools. But it requires being as steady as possible. So if you can get something like a tripod for your phone, you could do it, and you can adjust the exposure. So to adjust the exposure, there are ways to do it on your iPhone. When I tapped my screen, that's overexposing it and underexposing it. That's one way to do it. But ultimately, you're going to have to know your device on how to work your camera or how you work your phone to be able to get those results. Okay. So if you have any questions on how that actually works, you can come talk to me. You can show me your camera, and we can figure out how to do that. Okay. So you'll take 1 overexposed, 1 underexposed, and 1 normally exposed photograph. Okay. Ideally with as little movement as possible, unless that's the goal, is to capture movement. Okay. But depending on how quick you do that will ultimately determine how successful the image. If you're really slow at taking the photographs and it takes you 10 minutes to take the 3 photographs, you could get something very funky because people have completely walked off the scene at that point. So it may not be the result that you're looking for. But for now, let's look at how we're going to create that using how we're going to create an HDR image using the images that we have here. Okay, I'm not going to access them from Canvas because I have them on my thumb drive. Okay, so I'm going to open up Photoshop. So you guys can do this and do this as I'm working, or you can do it after. Completely up to you. The process of actually creating the actual image in Photoshop is actually quite easy. It's not the actual time it takes is literally a few seconds. So where the time actually incurs is actually going out and taking photographs. Okay, that's that's really where a majority of your time is going to be spent, and how to and actually doing that properly. So you might actually want to practice if you're going to go out and do it. Practice at various levels of exposures. You might just overexpose it and underexpose it just a little bit. You might try the same photograph, really highly overexposed and really highly underexposed. So there's obviously a big wide range on how much that might be. So you'll have to kind of experiment in what works well with you. Okay. Every image will be different. So a lot of times it might be helpful to take 3 or 4 series of 3 images so that you can get the right one. Okay, so let's look at some of these images and what they actually look like. All right, so I'm going to go over to these images. This is sample image number 4. Okay, and let's look at the differences between the 3 images. So this right here is probably, I forget which one's overexposed and which one's underexposed. I think this one right here is probably the normal exposure. Okay, so if you look at this image, you can see that you have some pretty nice kind of color in the rocks in the foreground, but you start to lose some of that contrast in the trees and the sky in the background. Okay, you look at this image right here, you can see that our sky is starting to be fairly washed out, even though it's kind of starting to make some of those colors and the contrast pop in that portion of the image, but you lose a lot of that in your foreground. Notice that our rock color between this one and this one, they're a lot different. Okay, so that's 2 of the photographs. And then this is going to be our underexposed photograph. Notice that you start to get some of the kind of the rich colors and the detailing of the sky, what's going on in the background, but you lose a lot of that in the foreground. Okay, so you get there's positive and negatives of each of these 3 photographs, and our end goal is to combine the 3 together to get an HDR photograph. Okay, so let's bring these into Photoshop and let's look at that process and how to do that. So the first thing that we're going to do, we'll open up Photoshop and you're going to get something that looks like this. You're not going to create, you're not going to create anything. Okay, so as soon as your Photoshop opens up, what you're going to do is you're going to go to File, and then you're going to go down to Automate. Okay, and then you're going to click on the selection on the right hand side that says Merge to HDR Pro. Okay, so we're going to click on that button, and you're going to get this little pop-up that looks like this. Okay, and what that's going to allow you to do is to select all of the images that you want to combine. So whether it's 3, it could be 5, it could be 7, etc. They're all just different ranges of exposures, which are essentially all capturing a certain level of light in the photograph. Okay, so what you're going to do then is you're going to leave this on Files. Okay, you could also do Folder. If all your images are in one folder, you could change that to Folder and just select the folder. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and leave it on Files, and I'm going to click on Browse. Okay, and then I'm going to select my 3 images that I had created. Okay, and I'm going to hit OK. All right, so it's going to load the 3 images on my screen. You're going to want to make sure that the button that's on the bottom that says Attempt to automatically align source images, you're going to make sure that's checked. So if there's any movement, or if there's any slight movement in maybe your camera or images inside the scene, Photoshop will do its best to align those images so that you don't have any blurring or distortion in the image. Okay, so I'm going to check that box, and then I'm going to hit OK. Now Photoshop's going to do some stuff. It's going to do its magic. Okay, it's just telling me that this images was taken with multiple cameras, which I don't think was actually the case, but for whatever reason it thinks so. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. You likely will not get that pop-up, just by the way. Okay, so and then you're going to get a screen that looks like this. Okay, so this is not the final merged HDR image, but what it's doing, notice that over here on the bottom, it's showing the 3 images and their exposure value. Okay, so it's showing you the first one, which is just your normally exposed one. And then you had your overexposed image, which is actually the one that had the richer color in the foreground. And then you had your underexposed image on the left-hand side. Okay, so you can see those different exposure values. And a lot of cameras, especially with the DSLR, you can easily adjust all of that so that you can get those different levels. Okay. So, and then you can see here in the image, this is actually showing you an example of what that HDR image looks like. Okay, so let's just look at really quickly. Notice that we have nice and really rich colors. You get really nice depth in all the shadows in the rocks, in the trees and the branches and the snow. So you get all of that really rich coloring here in the foreground, but you also get it both in the background and in the sky. Okay, so there's not any portion of this image that's washed out or underexposed or overexposed. Okay, so it's combining all three images. Now let's just compare it back to what we had a second ago. Let's see, let me try. I'm trying to get these side by side. Almost there, almost there, almost there. Okay, so you can actually kind of get an idea of here. This was I think this was the normally exposed image. Okay, so that's this image right here of the three. Look at the difference between the lighting levels throughout the image. Okay, the obvious difference is you can really see it right here in the foreground. But look at the trees in the background, how you really lose a lot of, the shadows are so dark that you lose a lot of the detail and the depth of that image. But then you go over to the right, and you can actually see, you can start to see the individual kind of sticks in the, in the bones and the guts of the trees. So you can see that all the way through the entire image. Okay. So just minimize that. So from here, bring that back up. It will allow you to make a few more edits. Okay, you're probably familiar with, it'll allow you to make a few more edits to this image prior to actually bringing it into Photoshop or into your typical Photoshop environment. You can do those things here if you want. You can also do them in the typical Photoshop environment. Okay, so you can adjust the shadows. Okay, depending on what you're ultimately trying to accomplish. Okay. These numbers will always be a little bit different depending on what photograph you are creating an HDR image of. Okay, so it's Photoshop's software that's it's telling you that this is what it feels are the optimal conditions for this particular photograph. You might pick one of the other three, and all of these numbers might be completely different because that's how it feels. It looks the best with these different settings. But if you want to adjust them and make it a little bit different, you can do that here. But you can also do it once you're in the software. I typically don't change much of this, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and hit OK, and then that will give you your final image here in Photoshop, okay? So this right here, this background layer, is our new HDR image. And from there, you can continue to add your various different adjustment layers and various other techniques. So you'll notice if you go to the assignment today and you click on assignment 6, it's going to tell you that there's kind of several different parts. And the second part after creating the HDR image is to take it into Photoshop and play around with using some of the different adjustment layers. So very rarely, actually I won't say that. Sometimes you will get the perfect HDR image and you may not want to make any adjustments to it whatsoever. It might come out just in tip-top shape and that's the way that you want to present it. But don't be afraid to continue to analyze the photo and continue to adjust it to get what you're looking for, okay? If you're trying to get one of those kind of one of the more artistic views of an image like what we were just looking at, you're going to want to use those tools like dodge and burn. You might want to adjust the levels or the curves to get something that you're ultimately trying to achieve. Okay, so this whole section of the assignment, it's not saying that you have to go in and apply a levels, a curves, adjustment layer. These are all suggestions. You might use one of them, you might use none of them, you might use all of them. Okay, so continue to take it into Photoshop and make the final HDR image. So what you're going to present to me once we talk about InDesign here in a second is you are going to show the three photographs. You'll show the underexposed, the overexposed, and the normally exposed image, and then you're going to show the final. Okay, the final using also showing the different adjustment layers that you added to it. Okay, or blending modes, etc. All right, does that make sense? So that I could see the transition between all three images. All right, any questions about that? Here, I'll do one more really quickly. We'll just do one of those other examples, and then we will move on to InDesign. All right, So I'm just going to close out of that. Don't need to save it. So again, I'm going to go to File. I'm going to go to Automate. I'm going to go down to Merge to HDR Pro. All right. I'm going to click on Browse. And then let me go back to one of my other sets of images. Maybe we go to 3. I'll select these 3 images. I'll hit OK. And I'll hit OK again. So that's an example of the overexposed image. Okay, you can clearly see it right here. You can clearly see this is the overexposed, normally exposed, and underexposed. Okay, see it plus 201, 0, minus 2, basically. Okay, so you can see it's really dark, normal, and very light. All right, so then we have our HDR image. We're gonna go ahead and hit OK, and that will bring it into Photoshop. Okay, you saw that difference right there when it transitioned it from the old photograph to the new. All right, any questions about that process? Okay, all right, so let's move on to InDesign. So today we're just going to do a quick introduction to InDesign. All right, so after today's lecture, we're still going to have 3 more Photoshop lectures on some other processes that we'll eventually learn. But today I just want to give you the brief introduction to Photoshop so that you guys can start to present your work using this software. Okay, so and we'll actually have lectures specifically in about 2 weeks or so. We'll have lectures specifically geared towards InDesign and graphic design and things along that line. Okay, so let's take a quick little glimpse on it before I let you guys loose to start working on our HDR photography. Okay, so as soon as you click on InDesign, you're going to double click on it, and this is going to be our first screen that we're going to run into. Okay, before we move on, how many people here have used InDesign before? Good, a couple, just a couple. This probably Photoshop in my professional career is probably what I use the most in terms. I actually don't use it so much on the photo editing side, but I use it a lot more on the rendering side and actually masking photos and combining photos. But in terms of presentation, InDesign is actually what I use probably the most and what I prefer. So programs like Revit, AutoCAD, yes, you can lay out your sheets in all those programs and you can lay out your design, but ultimately I'm going to have the most freedom using a piece of software like InDesign. Okay, I have probably hundreds of more fonts, hundreds of more tools, and exactly how I want to lay it out, and I can actually start to give more of a graphic design touch to my presentation. So what I do mostly for my job is actually create design packages. So mostly what I do is I get the project approved with the city, and then it moves on to construction documents and your basic sheet layouts where you lose all that prettiness.
This used to be called PageMaker, and then as the world morphed into the digital world, it changed its identity.
Yeah, yes, that's true. So who uses this most? Mostly graphic designers, people that create things like magazines, newspapers, books, different types of graphic spreads, things of that nature. Okay. Illustrator is also very similar. You could do a lot of the same things that you can do in InDesign in Illustrator, but InDesign is more focused on the multi-page spread. Okay, so not just creating one board that you might pin up on the wall, but creating multiple. Okay, so a lot of my design packages for work might be 10, 15, 20, 30 pages long. Okay, of showing all the different design details of the building that I'm proposing. Okay, so I like to use programs like InDesign. Okay, so we'll get into this in much more detail. Question in about 2 weeks.
Just a little add-on. A lot of other sites, like I've been using Wix lately, trying to make my own website.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of other sites use a InDesign plugin.
Use InDesign as like a platform.
Yeah.
Yeah. Correct. Okay, so as soon as we open up InDesign, you're going to get a screen that looks like this. And what we're going to do is we're going to click on the template called Document. Okay, so these are all templates right here. Depending on which one you choose, we'll kind of guide you in the path of creating that kind of document. We're not going to create a book. They all essentially will do the same thing, but I typically like to use the document template. So I'm going to click on that. and then it's going to bring up the new template screen. Okay, and from here we can start to establish some of the framework of what our project will start to look like. Okay, so you'll notice things like the number of pages, what pages you want to start on, the size of the paper. Okay. And then you can start to set things like margins. Okay, I'm not going to get into this in much detail right now. We'll look at this much more later on. So, but for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to uncheck facing pages. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and leave it on 1. Okay, you can always add pages later. So this, you literally can. It doesn't matter what you choose here. I usually like to start on 1, and I'll add as many pages as I want. A little bit later. I'm going to change the page size to tabloid. Okay, I like to work on 11 by 17 paper, just a little bit more real estate to plot out your work. And a lot of what I do, because a lot of my buildings are retail buildings, and they tend to be longer, I like to have that longer real estate to put my work on. And I've noticed a lot of my students have done the same thing. You don't have to choose tabloid. If you would rather do letter and you want 8.5 by 11, that's fine. A lot of the printers here at school print both, so it doesn't really matter too much. But I'm going to pick tabloid, okay, and I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. Oh, shoot, sorry. I did one thing wrong. Let me go ahead and start that over. Let me hit document one more time. Before we actually move on, let me show you one thing. So I'm going to click on tabloid. Over here, orientation. So originally I clicked on portrait. That's why it was actually really tall. I actually want it on landscape so that my page is a lot wider than it is tall. We'll talk about later on what these units of measurements are. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click on the other picture, so the landscape version, and then I'll go ahead and hit OK. So now we have our spread. Okay, so what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be creating a title block. Okay, so essentially what the title block does in the world of architecture is it allows you to put a variety of data, things like your name, the project name, what it is that you're doing, who is working on the project, along with submittal dates, various different types of things. So what we're going to do today is a little bit different. That's the overall goal of what we're creating. Is we're creating kind of a template that you're going to put all your work on the remainder of the semester. Okay, so when I look at your work, I can clearly understand who it is. I can clearly understand what the project is, when it was submitted, etc. Okay, so let's just look at a couple quick examples from last semester of what that was. Some of these are really good, some not so much, and some work really well. What we'll do today will end up being refined later on. Okay, I'm not expecting you to do a perfect, beautiful title block right off the get-go. Okay, but this will give us something to start laying out our work on. Okay, so this was an example of someone who turned in. They created this little box here at the bottom of the page. You'll see that his is kind of oriented on the bottom. I see them a lot oriented over here on the side. I see them on the top. Sometimes they're on this side, but typically they're on one of the edges of the page. Okay, so that you still have the majority of the real estate of the paper to work with. Okay, so this person's title block shows his name, it shows the class, the date, he created a little logo, and along with exercise 5. Okay, for now that works just perfect. I actually have some examples of this exercise from a couple semesters ago. Actually, we don't even really need that. Let's just show it like this. Okay, so here's an example of one that was created. So they made this title block that was oriented on the right-hand side of the page. Okay, they added the DVC logo. They had a little logo that they created for themselves. All right, the title of the class along with little extra details, exercise 6, and sheet 1. So there's actually, I think he had multiple sheets where he had sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3. So he started to add those different details that start to kind of identify what it is that he's doing for this project. Okay, these are all examples of actually the modified versions later on down the semester. So I don't necessarily I don't necessarily expect everyone to create a really nicely organized, graphically considered title block right now. But this will at least give you, today's lecture will at least give you the tools to start creating something like this until we actually talk about graphic design and why we make the decisions we make. Okay, so that's one title block. This was another one. Okay, so this was oriented a little bit differently. This was oriented on the bottom of the page, but you can see here that he showed the original and he showed the edited version. Okay, so the layout, although very simple, it's really easy to understand and it's really easy to figure out what it is that he was doing. Okay, and we'll talk about the graphic design of this a little bit later on. But this is kind of what I'm after today, is you guys are going to be creating this title block and then you'll be adding your original images and your final image on one page. So you might be turning in a total of 3 different pages by the end of the day. But you can see his title block, very simple, nice kind of contemporary gray, exercise 6, a little pop of color, all right, DVC, the name of the assignment, and the sheet number, okay? So these are kind of the basic components. I'll actually upload these onto Canvas so that you guys can have some examples. But these are kind of the basic components of what you'll add to your title block, okay? So name of the class, DVC, name of the assignment, and preferably your name and a sheet number, okay? So here's another one. This is actually one of my favorite ones. They actually took this little gradient, they added a page number, student's name, and actually a little silhouette of the San Francisco skyline. Yeah, pretty interesting. Kind of tells me a little bit about the person. Before and after picture. So pretty good. And the last one, a little bit different. He actually created a little bit of a frame, and he kind of created kind of a more sketchy look, as if it was kind of like line paper. Okay, so you kind of have the freedom to do whatever you want. There's really no rules to a title block, but you can see in these examples kind of the different components of what makes the title block successful. Okay, so this is kind of the base of how you'll start to order a lot of your exercises throughout the remainder of the semester. Okay, and eventually we'll actually kind of diverge from the title block because we're going to focus more on of how things are organized in the whole larger sense versus just simply pasting our imagery on a title block. Okay, so we'll kind of go on different phases throughout the semester and how we use these. But for now, we'll start to lay out all of our work onto these title blocks that we create today. Okay, so we got our sheet layout. You can see that like Photoshop, just kind of breaking down how this is laid out, you'll notice a lot of similarities. Okay, we have the upper horizontal ribbon where you have a variety of different tools. You also have your vertical ribbon on the left-hand side. You'll notice a lot of very similar tools. You have your selection tool, your direct selection tool, your text tool, line tool, pen tool. Those are all the same. Those are all tools that are found in Photoshop. They're also found in Illustrator. Okay, so as you start to open up the different pieces of software, you'll notice a lot of similarities amongst the 3 that we're going to look at. Okay, so you have your vertical toolbar, and just like you did in Photoshop, you have a variety of different toolbars over here on the right side too. Okay, you have things like layers. Okay, you have things like layers. You have things called links. Okay, pages. So this is actually where all of your pages will be displayed. Okay, if you want to add new pages, if you click on pages, you can click on this button right here at the bottom that says that we'll start to add pages. Notice that it's actually adding them in a sense that how a book would actually be laid out. Okay, we'll talk about later on and how to adjust that and how to make it look exactly the way that you want it to. Okay, but for now, that kind of gives you a sense on how this is laid out. I'm going to be kind of vague today in terms of that. We'll actually go into this in much more detail once we kick off InDesign kind of officially later on down the road. Okay, but for now we're going to kind of focus on just the one-page layout of the title block. So I'm going to minimize this. Okay, and notice that over here on the left and at the top we have kind of our rulers. Okay, If you right click on that ruler, it'll allow you to change the unit of measurement into which you can view these. Right now, the default is picas. Picas is a unit of measurement that a lot of newspapers and magazines use to do their measurements, but we're not going to use that. We can actually just change this to inches. Do the same thing on the other side so that we can kind of get a sense of where we are on the page. Okay, so to start to create that title block, I'm going to do kind of a basic one over here on the bottom. I'll create something that looks probably kind of like this one right here. Okay, so we're going to look at some of the basic shape tools. I'll also look at some of the basic text tools and how we're going to start to bring in the different imagery onto our sheet. Okay, so let's look at some of those tools. The first one I'm going to look at is the rectangle tool. Just like Photoshop, if you click on the rectangle tool and you notice there's this little black triangle at the bottom corner, that just means that that tool can be expanded into a variety of other tools. Okay, so I'm going to click on the rectangle tool, and then from there you're going to notice that my cursor turns into a set of crosshairs. Okay, so it just changes a little bit, and from there I can start to lay out that rectangle. So how big that is, the size, the dimensions, that's completely up to you. So you guys can use your imagination and what that looks like, and then we'll refine it later on in the class. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and let it bleed right off the page, okay? One little tip about InDesign is that regardless of what comes off the page, if you guys wanna actually have imagery that's flowing off the page, when you plot this as a PDF later, it will only plot what is within the extents of that boundary from the 11 by 17 page. So that boundary is this black line that you see right here. Okay, so notice that as I move my cursor, notice that there's also a little dash line up here on your arrow so that you kind of get some correlation to where you are on the page. But this black line is going to represent the actual edge of the paper, okay? Whereas the pink line is actually just a suggested margin that InDesign is telling you to use, okay? By no means do you have to work with inside that margin. You can set that margin to whatever you want. We'll look at how to do that later. But usually a lot of people set those margins based off of printer margins, okay? So the way that it's set up right now is probably pretty close to how a printer actually works. So it's good to understand and to always keep in mind what the end goal is of what it is that you're creating. Are you creating something that is only going to be viewed on your screen and digitally? Or is it going to be something that's going to be printed and is going to be handed out? So if you're not aware, when you print something, the printer won't print to the edge of the paper. So a lot of modern day printers can actually get pretty darn close. I want to say they can get within like maybe within like a 1/16 of an inch. Probably the average printer is like an 1/8 of an inch, okay? So a lot of people will set that margin just so that they have an understanding of where that printer boundary actually is, okay? So you can actually technically design for both digital and for print use, but just understand that when you print, it may actually be clipped off, okay? When you actually get a picture of something that is where it actually bleeds off to the edges, it's because it's been trimmed, okay? So someone's actually taking a trimmer or some kind of a machine that actually trims those edges so that your artwork can go right to the edge of the page. And a lot of times that is desired. That's typically at an extra expense. It usually costs a little bit more money for someone to do that, but it usually actually looks really good. So something to consider when you guys are doing your portfolios. All right, so let's create the base of our title block again. I'm going to click on that rectangle. Moving up here to our upper horizontal ribbon, we have two different colors. We have a top color and we have a bottom color. That top color is going to represent your fill. So if I make a box right now, my fill is going to be nothing. So that line says there's no fill. Whereas our boundary of our shape that we're creating is going to be represented by that second color. So if I make a box right now, you'll notice that the border of my box is black and there's actually nothing on the inside. If I had some artwork behind it, you would see that artwork behind it because there's no fill. But if I select that box, and I could start to change my fill. Notice that I can, blue, pink, yellow, red. I can change that to whatever color I want. Okay. If you hold down Shift and double click on that box, it'll actually open up a color picker menu. So if you don't like any of the standard colors that InDesign suggests, you can go through here and play with those ranges of colors till you get what you're ultimately going after. Okay, so I am going to make a nice little ribbon at the bottom of my page. I'm going to do something maybe nice and slender. I kind of like my title blocks nice and sleek. You also don't necessarily have to have a box or something like that. You don't have to have lines that define a boundary. It might just be a series of text or a series of colors or shapes that ultimately kind of define what that title block means. Okay, but for what I do today, I'll keep it kind of simple. I'm going to go ahead and keep it kind of slender. I'm essentially going to create something very similar to what we saw here. Okay, I actually very much like this, or I like this title block right here. This is something very similar to what I would probably create in my real life. I like grays. I like simple colors and little pops of color. Things like this orange. It's not overly distracting. It's simple and easily understood. So I typically like things like that. The goal of the title block is to not to have so much pop that it eventually distracts from what it is that you're selling on the actual sheet. So you do want a sense of simplicity to it. Okay, but you do want it to be nice in terms of its graphic layout. All right, but that's typically what I'm thinking was when I'm creating my title block, is that I don't want it to be so colorful that it takes away from what's going on in your presentation. Okay, so I am going to do this is also called the stroke, the second color. I'm going to do no stroke so that I actually don't have a colorful border. Instead, I am actually going to just change this color to gray. So I'm going to double click on that black, and I'm going to change my gray value. An easy way to get gray is to actually just change all of the RGB colors to the same number. Depending on how high or how low those numbers are, will be how dark or light of your gray is. Doing this a whole bunch of times, I'm going to do like 120, 120, 120. That gives me a nice medium gray. Okay, so that gives me kind of the basis of my title block. To scroll in and out, just like Photoshop, if you hold down Alt, a lot of your quick keys and shortcuts in Photoshop are going to be exactly the same in InDesign. So if I hold down Alt, I can zoom in and out, and I can see what's going on in the rest of my page. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and let this bar just kind of die right off the edges. Okay, that's okay, because when I plot this, it's going to plot only what's within inside the boundaries of this image. Okay. All right. So from here, I'm going to show you guys the text tool. So if you go over here and you click on the text tool, I can then define an area for where that text tool, or for where that text will lie. Okay. And then from there, I can go and select from hundreds of fonts. Okay. From what you might want to use, you can select a font size. You can select the style of the font. Okay. And along with a variety of other tools. Okay, we'll actually have a whole lecture on text and typography a little bit later, but that kind of shows you where that's located. Okay, I'll pick something, kind of fun. Maybe I'll just pick. Let's do this one right here. Okay, I might end up changing it later, but I'm gonna pick maybe size. Let's do like 25. No, that's still kind of small. Let me do 35. All right, let's do that. I'm going to go ahead and say the assignment name. So maybe we do exercise 7, 6, HDR photography. Okay, so there's my title. So there's kind of the basis of using the text tool. If you want to change the color of your font, you can select that font like so. So I'm going to select that font, and then up here in my larger horizontal ribbon, I might change the size or the color of that text to maybe white. Okay, So just depending on what color what your backdrop is of your text would ultimately determine that. I'm not going to put black on dark gray because I wouldn't be able to read it. So I'm going to go ahead and pick paper, so that'll be the same color as the background. I can't see it now, but if I actually bring it over to my title block, I can actually see that, okay? And typically the white on black only works well if you have really bold font. If it's a really thin font, you won't be able to really read it, so just something to keep in mind. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and drag the extents of my text to fit my screen. Let me zoom out so that I can get a sense of where it is my text is. You'll notice, if you've ever used AutoCAD or similar programs like that, you'll notice that when you move your text and your objects around on your screen, that it'll actually start to snap into certain areas. It'll snap to the center of the screen, it'll snap to the edges. Okay, notice that as I'm bringing this around, you'll see that there's a green line down here. It's actually telling me that the text that I am putting is actually centered on that box that I'm putting it on. So it's some of the kind of the smart tools that are built into InDesign in terms of layout, okay? So it gives you some nice little organizational tools. Right now, it's telling me that it's aligned to the box that I'm working on, but it's also centered on the page. That's what that pink line is, okay? So you'll notice that happening when you're working on your project, okay? So I'm just gonna quickly go add a couple more elements to this. All right, I'm gonna copy and paste this, and I'm gonna maybe make this a little bit smaller. Okay, so that I can put a little bit more information on this. I might do Diablo Valley College. Let me make my text box a little bit bigger. I'm going to say Archie 135 and maybe my name. So I'll do Matthew. All right. So I'll have something that kind of looks like that. I can add a little bit more text. It fits. There's a nice hierarchy to my text. Okay, we'll talk about this a little bit more. So I get some sense of what's really important on that title block. So that's why I have kind of a variety of different sizes of text depending on what it is that you're trying to draw the person's attention to. Okay. So from there you can add your different text and depending on what information you're trying to convey. Okay. So those are just a couple different tools. So explore, for creating your title block today, explore the different shape tools, explore the text tools, and you might also use the line tool. Those are probably about all you're going to need for today. Later on, when we actually look at more of the tools, you can certainly expand on that and make it better as you learn more tools. But those three tools right there will get you pretty far in terms of this exercise. Okay. If you want to add more pages, as I mentioned earlier, you can click on pages and you can begin to add them right here and copy those different elements onto your other sheets. A little trick, okay? You'll notice that the assignment talks about master files today. You can copy your elements to your other sheets a variety of different ways. One of which you could do today. Let's say you add a sheet. I could go over to my original sheet. I could select everything that I have created. And if I want it to appear in the exact same place on my other sheet, I can do Control-C for copy. And I can go down to my other sheet, zoom in, and if I right-click and if I go to, let's see, where is it? Paste in place. Oh, actually, I know why that didn't do that. So one of the options when creating your sheet is if you uncheck the facing pages option, this will actually work a little bit differently. So let me just show you that. So I'm going to uncheck facing pages, and this will create the same layout that I just had. Okay, so I'm unchecking the facing pages button, which is what you'll want to do today. I'm going to hit OK. Notice that when I add a new sheet, that it's not creating them like a book. Okay, we don't necessarily need that today. We're not creating a We're not creating our portfolio. Eventually we will get to the stage where that's how we want to create our sheets, but for today we don't need to. So let me copy this actually over. Okay, so let's say you created this on your first page and you want to copy it in the exact same place as your other page. You can Control-C, copy it, go down to my second page, and if I right-click and I go to paste in place, it will copy it in the exact same place as your other sheet was. Okay, so a nice quick little tool in terms of kind of speeding up production. In terms of InDesign, we'll talk about a whole slew more of those later on, but that's going to be your add page option. Okay, I'm actually going to skip. You'll notice in the exercise that it talks about using the A master slide. I'm actually going to skip that for now. We're going to save that for our actual InDesign, our first InDesign lecture later on down the road. But using that paste in place will help you to creating a nice, in terms of duplicating your different design elements to multiple other pages. Okay? Any questions about that? You probably have a lot. That's okay. I just want to kind of give you the basics in terms of some of these elements. So those three tools will give you a lot in terms of just bringing your, in terms of organizing your images in the software. Okay? Let's quickly go over importing some of your imagery. Okay? So what you might do, you can do this a couple different ways, one of which is the simple drag and drop. You could just actually you could open up your Explorer and you could just drag those images right onto your canvas. Okay, notice that when I slide them over, it actually shows me a little thumbnail of what I'm about to drop onto my screen. And as soon as I click down, it will drop that image. Okay? So depending on the size of the image, that could totally vary. You might drop an image that's humongous and it could be, you know, triple the size of your spread. That will happen just depending on the size of the imagery. Okay, some easy ways to fix that is you'll notice that in InDesign, there's kind of a built-in cropping tool. Okay, so depending if I grab these little toggles on my image, I can actually crop the image really easily simply by just reducing the sizes of the boundaries of that image. Okay, so if you're trying to show something specific, you can start to crop it in that fashion. And what's nice about that is you can open it back up, and you can still retain the original dimensions should you want to do that. Okay, so that's just a little brief intro on cropping. If you want to make it bigger, what you'll do, let's say you want to make this, you know, a little bit larger so you can start to fill the screen more. What you might do is you can take this little toggle right here. I'm going to hold down Shift so that I retain the proportions of that image. I'm going to make it the size that I want, so maybe it's about that big. Notice that it's expanded the boundary of the image, but it's actually just showing the white space around it. Okay? If you right-click on that image, and you go down to, click on it first, then right click. We're going to go down to fitting, and you're going to click on fit content to frame, okay? And that will fill up that frame that you created for that image, okay? So I'm going to leave it at that, okay? We'll talk about a little bit later on all those different options, and we'll talk about a variety of different ways, but that should at least now get you to the point where you can start to organize your assignments in InDesign, okay? Once you get to the point where you're done with your title block, save it just as a title block file, okay? Save it just as the title block without anything on it, because you're gonna use that as a base file later on down the road. So for exercise 8, exercise 9, 10, what you would do, sorry, I lose my voice a little bit. What you would do is you would actually just open up your original title block file. You would resave it as your new assignment and start to assemble all your images. But you're always going to want to keep this raw title block file without any imagery on it. Does that make sense? Okay, so you always have something as kind of the basis or the start of where you're going to assemble your images. Okay, sound good? Any questions about that at all? If you will run into problems, I guarantee you will run into things that aren't working or aren't making sense. If you have questions, just raise your hand today. I will tell you how to fix that today. but likely we will probably cover that here in the next couple weeks. I promise you.
What are the other techniques of importing imagery?
Oh, yeah. So there are more, of course, as I mentioned earlier. So you could also go over to File and then go to Place. Okay, just like Photoshop. Okay, so you can go to File and then go to Place, and then you could actually select that image. Okay, so I'm going to go to my thumb drive, go to today's lectures, HDR photography. I'm going to select my first image, go ahead and click on Open, and I'll be back to where I was as if I just dragged it in. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that. You'll notice that this image is obviously way too big, so reducing the scale of that would work the same way. Holding down the Shift button, I could now make that smaller. It's actually going to crop it. You'll notice that I've actually now initially cropped it, but if I right click on it and go to fitting, I can go to fit content to frame, and that will fit it back to that original size. Okay, so that would be the second way on how you would import your imagery. Okay, so last but not least, before I turn you loose, let's look at how we are going to export our work. Okay, so from here on out, I would like it if everything that you submitted was a JPEG or a PDF. Okay, InDesign does a great job of creating really nice booklets of PDFs, so you don't necessarily have to combine all of your imagery in Acrobat like we talked about earlier. That works really well when you have a multitude of kind of random files, but we're going to be creating our spreads in InDesign, so you don't have to do that. So let's pretend that this is the final, our final spread. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to File, and I'm going to go over to Adobe Pdf Presets. Once I go to Adobe Pdf Presets, it's going to give you a variety of different presets and how it would plot. I like to use high quality print. It gives you a nice high quality, high resolution image. There's no distortion to your imagery, but you do have some other options. Press quality is almost the same as high quality, but there's also smallest file size. So if your intent is to get the file size as small as possible, whether it be to print or it is to upload it online, you could use that option, but just like when we were using Acrobat, if you choose that, there are downfalls in that your image quality will be far less than some of the others. Okay, so just most of the time you're going to want to use high quality print, but there are other presets if you want to do that. So I'm going to click on high quality print. Okay, it's then going to ask you where you want to save it. Okay, so we're going to save it to our thumb drive. Whoops, disk drive. Who uses a disk drive anymore? So I'm going to click on my thumb drive. I'll click on today's class. I'm going to save it here, and I might call this exercise 7. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click on save, and then from there you're going to get a nice big screen that gives you all of your different PDF plotting options. Okay, so you're not going to, in fact, I don't think you're not going to change any of this. Okay. The only thing that you might change in the future is you might click on range if you want to print maybe just one or a selection of your spread. So if you have 20 pages, maybe you only want to print 2 or 3 pages. You might change that, but typically you're going to click on all. You're going to plot the entire package that you're creating. Okay, so as soon as you get to here, I'm going to click on export, and it will go ahead and create that PDF, and it will save it to the location that you specified. All right, so if I go backwards on my thumb drive, I will see that right here. Okay, and notice that it's a nice clean export. InDesign is a vector program. It's not a raster program like Photoshop. So what's really nice about it is that you can expand your work that you do smaller and larger without distorting it. Okay, but unlike Photoshop, you can have a combination of both raster and vector images, which right here you would have that. This would be a raster image embedded in a vector layout.
Can you repeat that point? InDesign will display both vector and raster.
Exactly. So the plus, and we'll have a whole lecture on vector versus raster images, but the plus of using InDesign is that Things like text shapes, lines can be made smaller or larger without them distorting. So really nice quality. But you'll notice that when you export that, notice that my band at the bottom is right to the edge. Okay, it's just as you saw it here in the file. Okay, so that band goes right up to the edge of my screen, just like you see it right here. Okay, so this is what you would upload onto Canvas. This is what I'm looking to receive for exercise 7. So exercise 6 is creating the HDR imagery. Exercise 7 is creating the title block and importing your images onto a layout. Okay, so use the tools that you learned today. Do the best you can. You will probably stumble on some certain things. I will help you, but I promise you we'll cover all the bases over the next couple weeks. All right, any questions? All right, so go ahead and we have a little bit less than an hour left. So use that time to create your HDR images and start creating your title block.